Psycho may just be one of the most famous movies ever made. Its shower scene has been parodied and referenced so many times that it's gone from the ultimate plot twist to complete common knowledge. However, there are some out there who have taken issue with its ending, saying that the scene where the doctor explains everything about Norman Bates' condition to be overly long and unnecessary. I've even heard one person say that the scene is the only thing keeping it from being, quote, a truly great film. Now, today I'd like to go over this very issue and explore whether it was objectively the right move to give such a long-winded explanation or not. And obviously there will be spoilers ahead, but considering this is Psycho, even if you haven't seen it, you probably already know what happens. But nonetheless, if you don't want anything else ruined, you should probably click off the video now. Okay, so as you probably already know, after Norman Bates is revealed to be the real killer, he's caught by the police and sent to a psychiatric hospital where the head doctor explains to the surviving characters and the audience what was really going on. Now, the obvious question to ask here is, from an objective standpoint, was it a good idea to have such a thorough explanation of Norman Bates' history and shattered mental state? And to that, I must say yes. You see, by today's standards, it's probably considered a bit much, but keep in mind that this movie was made in 1960 and it's been hailed as a revolutionary piece of filmmaking for a reason. Now, the main reason I believe that whole scene to be perfect as is because you have to keep in mind that in 1960, ordinary people didn't have a good grasp on mental health and diseases. Most movies up until that point had portrayed killers as either cold-blooded sociopathic murderers only out for themselves or as having complexes ripped straight out of Sigmund Freud's notebook. And this extended to real life as well. People who really had bipolar disorder were written off by normal people as having bad tempers. People who actually had some kind of mental illness were suspected as being a drunk. It was even believed by some that living in poverty could, in and of itself, be a mental illness. Now, I know this sounds harsh, but keep in mind that people back then weren't as well informed as we are today, and it was movies like Psycho that helped change that. You see, if the explanation weren't so thorough, audiences would either be left writing off Norman as completely insane at best, or left absolutely confused at worst. Because those people who've complained that it's easy to figure out what happened and don't need to be told, don't understand is, it may be easy to figure out what happened by today's standards, but in 1960, audiences were probably more confused than they'd ever been in their entire lives, seeing Norman come running into the cellar wearing a dress. They'd never seen anything like that before. So without such a long and definitive explanation of what happened and why he did what he did, the audience would have been left at a complete loss and would have inevitably drawn the wrong conclusions. In other words, it needed to be spelled out to them in big letters that Norman was psychologically destroyed by his mother, and after killing her in a fit of jealousy, had half his mind take over his mother's persona in order to cover up his immense guilt. Now, like I said, the audience today wouldn't need such a long explanation because there have been many both fictional and real life stories along these lines. So it's easy for us to understand and pick up on the missing details. But in 1960, audiences had never heard of such a thing, and so needed to be helped out as much as possible. Now, I know I made a video not long ago saying that sometimes it's better to leave something ambiguous as opposed to pulling back the curtain entirely, but obviously this was one case where everything was left better off being revealed, especially for the sake of the audience. And for what it's worth, Alfred Hitchcock certainly seemed to believe that this was the case, as after the scene was filmed, he reportedly bowed to the actor playing the doctor and said, "You just saved my picture." Basically, he understood that the audience needed that scene in order for the movie to work. So, to simplify it as much as possible, if Psycho were made today, it definitely wouldn't need such a long explanation about what's wrong with Norman Bates. But in 1960, it was most definitely a needed scene. And that's what people have to keep in mind, is that when watching older stuff, you have to be willing to watch it through the eyes of a person from that time. You can't expect a movie made 100 years ago to be up to today's standards, as standards are always changing, and what was revolutionary back then will inevitably seem tame by today's standards. What I think is an even bigger issue is the level of disrespect some of these older movies get simply because they're older and don't completely live up to today's expectations. And this movie is a perfect example of that. Now, criticizing an explanation that was frankly very well done and very much needed because of the era it was in was bad enough, but what's even worse is how brutally they'll attack it. Because the thing is, exposition can be very boring and tiring to sit through and can often be unnecessary. When done wrong, it can often lead to that. But when done right, usually those scenes of exposition go on to be considered some of the best in the entire story. Whether it's world building in science fiction and fantasy movies, or the final explanation at the end of a detective story, exposition can be absolutely thrilling to listen to and even inspire your imagination in unexpected ways. And an excellent example of this would be The Matrix. Practically the whole second act is exposition, and yet it's still considered one of the best movies ever made, period. And why is that? Because not only is the exposition very natural, by having the main character be the audience surrogate, simple enough so the audience won't get too confused, and is frankly fascinating to sit and watch. In other words, while watching The Matrix, you don't care that half of it is just explanations, questions and answers, and clarifications, because the concept behind it is so intriguing, you want to learn more about it. And that's why exposition can make or break a movie, because when done right, it hooks the audience and will even have them craving more. And of course, without a proper amount of exposition, sometimes the story just won't work, and the audience will be too confused to enjoy it, which is the main reason why the studio actually mandated that as much of it be put into the Matrix as possible, so that the audience wouldn't end up confused. And I don't think anybody would say that that was a bad call to make, considering all the recognition the movie's gotten. Now, my point here is that's exactly why that scene at the end of Psycho works. Because not only was such an explanation required to keep 1960s audiences from leaving the theater confused, but frankly, it probably left them leaving on a fascinated and no doubt terrifying final note. Hearing exactly how Norman Bates developed his split personality firsthand, and then seeing the direct evidence of it and realizing just how sick he really is in the head. For 1960, that final scene was probably more horrifying than the shower scene, and all because his condition had just been explained very thoroughly, specifically so that they'd feel the impact of those final moments. And if stuff written at the time is to be believed, it most certainly worked. Now, as I mentioned before, I know I've said that sometimes ambiguity is better than explaining everything, but as I said in that same video, that obviously depends heavily on what story you're telling, and knowing which elements need explanations and which don't is key to making it work. Because while sometimes it's better to leave certain questions unanswered, Other times it's just as important to definitively answer everything. And Alfred Hitchcock understood that this was one case where he needed to explain everything to the audience in order for them to properly understand it. And considering the audience did end up loving it, and it went on to arguably become his most famous movie, you have to admit that he might have very well been onto something when he decided to take the deep dive into Norman's past and the truth of his condition. Okay, I think I've stated my case pretty well. I don't need to keep going on about it. So now I'd like to hear your thoughts. Do you believe that the explanation at the end of Psycho is necessary and a well done one? Or do you believe it's too long and drags down an otherwise great movie? Please feel free to tell me in the comments. And remember, you're free to disagree with this entire video if you want. I'm just here to have a discussion with you, nothing more. So thank you all for watching. I really appreciate it, and I hope to see you all next time.